timers here. We have about less than 1 minute.
I know. I think we're going to get started quicker than we normally do. Everybody's already on.
So too. Will, do you actually have a question, or are you just practicing with the chat box?
No, I actually have a question. I'm not sure if I missed the email or whatever, but was the PowerPoint distributed?
It was.
I believe so. Let's ask John and Rosalind to comment on that.
So you should have gotten an Outlook update from Sandra with all of the files. She had to send it in 2 batches. So one showed the agenda and a couple of the PowerPoint and the first 2 handouts, and then the second one should have had the second 2 handouts.
Okay.
If that is not working for you, you can also go into the website. Really interesting. The chat box won't let you paste. Oh no, here we go. I got it. And there's the county's website in the chat box, which you can download all the same information from.
Oh, okay. All right. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Rosalind, can you get everybody's name from here, or do we have to take time to go through that part?
Got a little bit of feedback today that wasn't happening last time. Did anybody else hear it, or is it just me?
I heard that while you were talking.
There's feedback. Maybe turn off your phones.
Patsy or me?
Well, right, don't really exist.
Did you hear the feedback with me or with Patsy?
It's maybe with you.
Okay, let me try my headset.
Say something.
Is that better?
Somebody still has feedback.
I could
hear the feedback when nobody was talking, so I don't know what that's about.
Okay, I'll turn my mic off until I talk.
Yeah, it might help. There we go, just for everybody to mute. So I will go through and list off all of the folks that I see for roll call, Patsy. So we'll start with Emily Michelson, Nate Brown with Jacobs, Nicole Paletto with Woodard and Kern, Anita Rejmi with DWR, I see Jim Bennett with the county, and Brad Blaze. Can you unmute yourself and identify who you're with?
Yes, I'm with the Pinery.
Got it. Thank you, Brad.
You're welcome.
Got it. And then I've got Sandra Carlson with the city, Frank Conan, Hank Rupp, John Ayers. Oh, were you going to correct me?
Yeah, it's Hank Rupp. Hank Rupp with Rancho Guajito.
Yes. John Ayers, Woodard and Kern. John Flores, welcome, with San Pasqual Tribe. Matt, I assume that's Weedland. It doesn't have your last name. And then Matt Whitman. We've also got Micah Eggleton with Woodard and Curran, Mike Bolari with the city, Patsy Tennyson, K&A, Peter Quinlan. It looks like Pinery has 2 call-ins. Brad, is that you on twice, or is that someone else?
No, I'm not on twice, and I believe that would be Dustin Miedor. He's calling from the office.
Got it. Okay, and then Will Halligan, one of our TPR members. I also see five different callers that are just identified as callers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. So if you could identify yourselves and what organization you're with, folks that are just on the phone.
Lonnie Lutar with Responsible Solutions.
Hi, Lonnie.
Hello.
Anyone else?
Rosalind, one of those may be me. This is Patsy because I called in and I'm also on the computer.
Okay. Is anyone else called in twice, once on the computer for visual and the other for audio?
This now
Yes.
I'm sorry, repeat that. Was that Sam?
No, this is Matt Whitman. I've called in and on the computer as well.
Okay.
Yes, this is Anita. I called in from my phone.
Awesome. Okay. I think that's everyone. Has anyone else not been named or introduced?
Yep, this is Alicia Appel. I'm from the City of Escondido Utilities.
Hi, Alicia.
Hi.
Okay.
Leanne is here too. I'm not sure if you said my name and I missed it. Leanne Crow from the county.
Yep. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Great. That's everyone.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. This is Patsy Tennyson. I want to just briefly go over a few things in these opening slides so that we all will know where we're going and what we're doing. So first, and we've already kind of had a demonstration of this, if you are on your phone and your computer, please mute one of the microphones, either the microphone on your phone or the microphone on your computer, because we do get feedback if we have both of those audio sources on. And also, you'll notice on this slide, at the bottom of the slide, it does have that computer, microphone, and camera circles, so that's where you would go to mute one or the other. Unless you're asking a question also, if you could keep your phones on mute or your audio on mute on the computer, that'll be really helpful. It'll also cut down on background noise since we all are working in places that we don't normally work. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. You'll see at the top of this circled in red on the top of your screen is something that looks a little bit like a thought bubble in a cartoon. That is the icon for the chat box. The way we're going to use that is if you have a question or comment at any time during the meeting, just as we already had demonstrated earlier, if you type in question or comment, I'm going to be monitoring that chat box, and after the agenda item, when we're ready to take questions, I'll go ahead and call on you. And I should also explain to you that my colleague Emily Michelson is our meeting organizer. You'll see the mention here of the organizer. Emily starts and ends the meeting. She's also muting everybody at the beginning of the meeting, and she will unmute folks when it's time for them to ask a question or make a comment. And I believe you've got some written instructions about how to use this system. Nicole Paletto is monitoring everything for technical issues. So if you do have a technical issue throughout the meeting, please contact Nicole. Here is her phone number. It's on that instructions list, but in case you don't have that handy, please write down 858-875-7405. Again, 858-875-7405. That's the phone number for Nicole. But you can also type your question into the chat box or your comment. And again, I will be monitoring that, and we will go to questions and comments at the end of the agenda item. The next slide, please. I think most of you who have been on meetings recently, if you've used the GoToMeeting, notice at the top it is something circled there that says View Everyone. If you go to that View Everyone and you click on that icon, you'll see a number of choices that come up. I know that I like to look at the slides full screen, so I usually click the Hide Everyone option on that icon, but this will give you a way to either change how you're viewing the screen or how you view everybody who's in the meeting. The gray bar, that gray horizontal bar, you can also move that, and that will let you change the aspect of the screen. And by the way, I see that Nicole has put into the chat box her telephone number, so you should all be able to pick that up. And thank you for doing that, Nicole, in case everybody didn't have a pencil or didn't get that instructions. So that's all the how-tos for me. Are there any questions at this point about how to use this GoToMeeting platform? I don't see anything in the chat box, but okay. Just as we would do if we were all together, John Ayers will be presenting the slides. Rosalind Prickett is taking notes and assisting with the meeting organization if she's needed. And right now, Sandra is going to tell us some information about the team.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So welcome to our GSP Go-To meeting. Thank you so much for being flexible in these challenging coronavirus times. I'm impressed that it's only 9/11. We're doing great. So again, I'm Sandra with the city, a project engineer for the GSP. As you can see from the photo, my supervisor, Karina Danik, she was pregnant. She had her baby in April. She had a baby boy named Raphael. She's home sleeping, I'm sure. So in her place, we have Nikki McGinnis, Principal Water Resources Specialist, taking her place. And Nikki has a lot of experience in San Pasqual Valley. She's been with the city for nearly 20 years and has attended just about all the previous advisory committee meetings, and she's up to speed with the GSP. One more change with the city is we've moved, for SGMA, we've moved the team to the Engineering and Program Management Division of the Public Utilities Department, and we have replaced Amy Dorman, who was the Deputy Director. We've now changed to, it is now Soraya Rashid, who is listening in today and to get to know everyone, and she will formally introduce herself at the next meeting in July. And as a reminder, the city formed a groundwater sustainability agency with the county for the San Pasqual Valley groundwater basin. So we're working in collaboration with the county, and our team members for the county that are on the line today are Jim Bennett and Leanne Crow, who are both part of the core team for the groundwater sustainability agency. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John.
Actually, Sandra, this is Patsy again. If you can wait just 1 second, John, I will get through the agenda and the meeting objective. As you can see, the slide is up that shows you what we're going to be talking about today. In just a minute, I'll go over those meeting objectives. But we're going to talk about the refined analysis and the basin definition, look at the technical input approach with the groundwater model, and monitoring networks. Then talk about preliminary analysis results, which last meeting we did talk about the undesirable results. and then a field program update that will cover monitoring well installation and isotope sampling, and then public comment. The meeting objectives, if you can go to the next slide. To gain input on the modeling and monitoring networks approach, to share the preliminary results for hydrogeologic conceptual model and groundwater conditions, and to discuss the basin definition. So that's what we're hoping to accomplish during this meeting today. We will take a brief break during the meeting, probably about mid-meeting, and we'll let you know when that time arrives. And then you should have gotten handout number 1, which was the meeting summary. The only other thing that I want to remind you of at this point is that we will be breaking at the end of each agenda item, as you recall from previous meetings, for AC member comments. That's members of the advisory committee. They have a time to comment at the end of each agenda item. And then at the very end of the meeting, we will be taking public comments. So if you are not on the advisory committee, but attending this meeting, go ahead and hold your comments until we call for public comments at the end of the agenda.
Patsy, I'm showing we've got 3 advisory committee members today, Frank, Matt, and Brad.
Yes.
Do I have that correct?
No.
That was what I wrote down.
No, Brad, this is Brad. I'm not a committee member.
Okay.
Oh, that's right, Brad. You are, okay, got it.
You've been attending the AC meetings, so I got a little tangled up. Thank you for clarifying. Okay, so Frank and Matt Whitman.
Right.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, John, I think you are up next, but I'm not controlling the slides, so.
I am controlling the slides, and I am up next.
Okay.
Perfect timing. So for the TPR meeting, we've got usually 3 categories. It's approach, preliminary stuff, and refined analysis. And so in the past, we've done that approach, preliminary, refined. Today, we're going to do the refined analysis first, then approach, and then the intermediate stuff again. So the refined analysis here is actually fairly brief, and assuming this thing wants to work, there we go. So the core team has been working diligently to come up with specific language about the basin definition. As TPR members remember, we've had a couple pretty exciting conversations about this. And so this is the full statement, and this will be going in under our basin settings part of the plan under the HCM for the basin boundaries. And so that is, the basin is defined by Bulletin 118 and includes the alluvium or residuum, the interaction between groundwater between fractured bedrock, and the alluvium or residuum is not well understood and represents a data gap in the understanding of the basin. Separate from that, we have a little follow-up, that is, if groundwater conditions require implementation of management actions, additional data collection studies, aquifer testing, and/or surveying, i.e. whatever study is necessary, may be recommended to improve understanding of this interaction. So what we're doing is following the regulatory water code and Bulletin 118 definition of the basin, recognizing that we don't understand the interaction between those units and the bedrock. And if we find later in the GSP that we have to do management actions to address things, we may not, we don't know yet. One of our recommendations will be improving that understanding, and then improving that understanding would be something that occurs during implementation, as well as making decisions related to that. One thing we're not doing as part of the GSP is identifying which wells are in or out of the basin. That's not a requirement under SGMA. That would be something under a management action that sort of stuff is happening in 2020 GSPs down the road. They haven't quite gotten there. Even in some of the ones that were submitted in 2020, they're starting to talk about those sorts of things, but they haven't decided yet. So this is something that the issue of whether a well is in the basin and thus subject to SGMA or not is something that would have to get addressed during implementation and only if it was necessary. So that's the overall bit here. We're looking for comments from the TPR on this.
Hi, this is Peter. So just to clarify, the management actions, the investigation of the interaction would occur during the next 5 years if conditions in the basin suggested management actions were necessary. Is that correct?
Right. So only if the GSA has to undertake management actions that require managing individual wells is this something that would be further investigated. If that's not the case, then I don't think it would be, other than for academic reasons. And GSAs don't undertake academic endeavors.
Hi, this is Matt Weedland. I was looking at some of the water level data at the USGS monitoring well nested piezometer station to the west of on the west side of the basin, and that information indicates that there is a small downward vertical gradient between the alluvium and the bedrock. And I presume that at some of the other USGS stations and the recent Kleinfelder installations, when we get water level data there, we should be able to assess whether there's a vertical gradient at those locations as well. So it seems to me that we do have some information here that could be used to help define the boundary condition at the base of the alluvial aquifer, or if you will, the decomposed granite. And although we don't have vertical hydraulic conductivity values to go with that vertical gradient information we have, it seems to me that we have the basis to at least start an approximation of whether or not this is something that's important enough to include in the model. And this really this question probably goes to Nate as to his thoughts on that. If he did have vertical hydraulic gradient information in areas that are probably not directly impacted by pumping, is that something that he would consider looking at in terms of defining the lower boundary condition?
Can folks hear me okay?
Yeah, your sound's great, Nate.
Okay, gosh, I was in a panic the last 5 minutes. I lost internet connection. I just got back in. So my apologies. I heard the tail end of that. I think I heard there are some vertical hydraulic gradient information, and to what extent could that information be incorporated into the model? Did I get that right?
That's right.
Okay. Yes, definitely. Both absolute water level data as well as, groundwater level difference between two different depth intervals. Both of those types of data would serve as good calibration targets. So they wouldn't be boundary conditions per se, but they would be targets that we would have in the model, so that when you run it, you'd be able to check not only does it do an adequate job with the water levels, but also how does it do with water level difference between layers.
Okay, Nate, I guess you missed the part where the head differences between a monitor wells installed in fractured rock and monitor wells installed in the overlying decomposed granite and alluvium. So the head differences across that contact between the alluvium and the bedrock, essentially.
Yeah, and that's okay. The model, what I'm thinking there is we tend to include model layers that would go down into bedrock. And really, for the GSP, what it comes down to in terms of the reporting, you know, you only have to report at the water yield, or sorry, water year scale, you know, the water budget information. So in other words, the model domain extends beyond the basin boundary, both laterally, you know, and vertically. It extends down into the indurated rock. So we have the opportunity, as you're pointing out here, to be able to see how do the water levels compare in the two different units. At the end of the day, for the water budgets that go to the GSP, those will just be rounded up based on, you know, interactions within the residuum and alluvium. That makes sense?
Yep. Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, Nate. This is Peter again. I understand what you're doing. You don't have a lot of information to characterize those layers that go into the bedrock. And as Matt pointed out, we don't have vertical hydraulic conductivity. We don't have horizontal hydraulic conductivity. So how are you going to approach that?
Right. So that through the calibration exercise, there will at least be some guidance in there to, you know, that's I guess was my point of including the vertical head difference as targets. So we will have the opportunity to adjust, you know, KH, KV, you know, those aquifer properties in an attempt to better match the water level differences between the layers. So it's through the calibration process, you're right. I think initially it's going to be based on literature values, but then as we get into calibration, if there's opportunities to adjust parameters within reasonable ranges to also match the head differences we're seeing in the different layers.
Okay. And you said it's going to extend out laterally. I'm thinking about flow, boundary conditions for flow into those lower layers. And are you incorporating the mountains and the upland areas around the valley where there is recharge directly into granite?
Yes.
And so how far out are you extending the model domain?
At this current time, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the salt and nutrient management plan, but the model domain that was used for that, you know, lateral model domain is the same. So it includes the areas that are downstream. It's essentially the surrounding catchment with the exception of where we have stream gauge data that allowed us to not have to include such a huge portion of the overall watershed. But certainly all the areas that are tributary to the Pasqual groundwater basin are included in the domain. So there's recharge occurring in those upland areas that can, you know, discharge into the basin area. But, you know, as you know, there's a lot of resistance to flow. You know, it's tight material outside of the basin, but it is the same domain as was used for the salt and nutrient management plan.
Nate, this is Sandra Carlson. Can I ask one question?
Sure.
So in understanding the vertical or even the horizontal boundary, if someone were to give us some, there's some background noise going on, but if someone were to give us some aquifer testing results, or if we were to do aquifer testing, would that give us the information that you would need, or how would we get that information to help define those parameters you're just discussing?
Aquifer testing, you know, would certainly help. You know, that would give information at least at that location what those properties are. As I mentioned, I mean, we can get to it to some extent through the model calibration process with what we have, and through that process, you know, better prioritize and reveal, you know, the most cost-effective data gaps to fill. But yes, generally speaking, what you're saying is true. If you want to know what the aquifer properties are in a certain area, certainly, focused aquifer testing is the most direct way to get to it.
Peter again. The isotope studies that are being done, couldn't those guide you in terms of recharge?
I'm not familiar with some of the details of the isotope, the specific isotopes they're looking at. And yeah, I wasn't involved in that aspect of it. So I'm not sure. I'd have to look into what isotopes they're looking at and where they're collecting them. So possibly, but yeah, I'm not sure at this moment.
So Nate, that means that you're going to need to do a water balance for the fractured rock area surrounding the basin?
Well, we don't have to report it in the GSP. I guess all I'm saying is that the domain itself extends beyond the Bulletin 118 boundary. And that's done because there's, a couple of reasons. One, there's a convenience in doing that because you're basically going out to no flow boundaries if you go out to the catchment boundaries.
Right.
And so, whereas if you were to come in closer to the basin boundaries, you have to kind of come up with some method for what you think inflows are from those upland areas into the basin. So by us going out to the catchment boundaries and then just putting in lower hydraulic connectivities and going through the calibration process, we don't have to come up with, boundary conditions. We just extend them out to those no flow boundaries on the lateral side. It's just that the reporting for the water budget in the GSP, we're only going to isolate that to the Bulletin 118 boundary, and including alluvium down through residuum, just because for compliance, that's the part that we need to actually report in the GSP. So there will be a water balance, everything in the active domain is part of the water balance. It's just we're going to be isolating just the water balance components for the Bulletin 118 basin. That makes sense?
Yeah, and I think so. I guess the part that I'm kind of wondering about is if these nested wells provide, say, 10 years of vertical head difference between alluvium, decomposed granite, and bedrock, so that we have something that takes us through at least some cycle of seasonality, wouldn't it just be simpler just to use those head differences for the term of the model? It's just something to think about. I don't know if you need to answer that right now, but
yeah, I'm not sure I follow you. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, what we really want to know is how much water is seeping out the bottom of the alluvial aquifer into the bedrock, and I'm pretty sure at this point that's what this information is telling us. There's not water flowing into the alluvial aquifer from the bedrock. It's going the other way, and so if there's a consistency in the gradient, at least in areas where the underlying bedrock is not being pumped, then you wouldn't have to deal with all that. You would just have to deal with figuring out what the flux is out of the bottom of the alluvial aquifer, starting with at least having in hand what that vertical gradient is over the course of, at least at one monitoring station, a course of, I don't know, roughly 10 years, I think. So,
yeah, and we need to be careful too, not generalizing. So I think, to your point, at that location, if there's a downward gradient, that's fine, and we can put the model through its paces during calibration and attempt to try to match that at that location. But that does not mean that the entire Bulletin 118 basin does not receive water from bedrock. I mean, it's a valley, right? So, I mean, there is going to be some flow reporting from the surrounding bedrock to the valley. It's just maybe not at that location, but it has to occur because it's a groundwater discharge point. It's a low point in the catchment.
Well, I'm not. Well, we've got multiple locations where we can look at that, and I don't know how long the history is at those other locations, but I certainly think that's something to look at. And from a regional flow perspective, I'm not sure that there's bedrock discharging into the basin. I'm not convinced of that, but we've got several locations with nested wells that we can check to see if that's the case. So
there's three nested groundwater wells for the USGS.
And then now we have 2 Kleinfelder locations.
The city just installed 2 more,
right?
But we have no data from them.
But that shouldn't take very long to get data, right?
It depends. We're the city.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's a 1-hour exercise to get water level data, but
water level data, sure, we can get that, but we don't have any history.
Right.
2, yes.
So I understand your caution, Nate. I appreciate that. But it seems like we potentially have 5 locations, maybe not 5 locations with a history, but at least 3 locations with a history to check that. And I don't know how big of a deal it is to incorporate the whole catchment area versus just looking at these heads. And I don't know. It's just, if it's not that much more work, then that's okay with me. It's not critical. That it's simply a notion. I think we got some valuable data here, and I haven't seen us look at it yet.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and we certainly will look at it. I think in terms of the level of effort, there's a convenience in that, just the timing of when the GSP regs came out relative to when the salt nutrient management plan was developed in 2014. I mean, we're not building it from scratch. And so the fact that we already had this model out to this domain already, I mean, we're building on that. It's not starting from scratch. So that there isn't, a lot of additional effort, including this management. So,
right.
I guess
I think it sounds like these are really important data, and we're certainly going to use them. And I'm sure, we can talk about this further as we go here.
Nate, this is Peter. I guess by going out to the basin boundary, you do get to the no flow boundary, so you're not estimating what the flow in is at an arbitrary vertical boundary in the middle of the basin.
That's right.
But you are having to estimate how much recharge there is that makes it into the fractured rock. So you still have the same exercise. And I don't know how well the salt nutrient management model, is calibrated or looked at that. Typically, if you're looking at surface water, you tell it what the infiltration is rather than calibrate to it.
Right. In this case, the improvements that will be made with the integrated flow model for this project is we're taking the salt nutrient management plan, which had steady state groundwater flow and very simplified stream, boundary conditions. That's all going to be converted to where we now have SFRs, the stream flow routing package. It'll actually route. There'll be linear features that represent these canyons. And as precipitation falls on the land surface, those streams wet up. And to the extent that we have, stream flow information to compare against, in this basin, there's not a whole lot of that. But we're basically going to be putting in where we have it, stream flow data that's coming in, Guajito Creek and San Isabel, and where we have the gauge data, we will use those actual flows and then the recharge estimates we're assuming in the upland area, all that is going to have to hang together and be defensible, because ultimately we have to, transiently match water level, groundwater level responses at all these different wells. So that's the process. Just to kind of walk you through that. So yes, we have to come up with some kind of what's the groundwater recharge component of precipitation falling into the watershed. But where we're going to be constrained is how much stream flow that generates, and does it match groundwater levels through time or not? And that's where the calibration process will help us fine tune that, to try to make sure we have parameter values that are all within reasonable ranges, but at the same time matching some of these basic observations through time.
Okay, I have a question that probably is best answered by John with regard to basin definition. I noticed this morning that in the Cloverdale area, the basin boundary crosses over the alluvium and leaves out a chunk of alluvium to the north. So I don't know if, John, if you're familiar where Cloverdale Ranch is, it shows up on the geologic map. But basically, the area I'm talking about is if you start at Cloverdale Road and San Pasqual Valley Road and go up that canyon there, the basin is terminated before the alluvium ends. And I'm wondering if you're familiar with what the rationale was for not in that, because it appears that there's probably pumping going on up gradient of that boundary, basin boundary.
This is Sandra again. We had DWR redefine our boundary. I believe it was in 2017. They physically came out and went physically around the land area and defined the basin boundary that way. So I can check with them, but I would trust DWR.
Well, I'm just interested. There's probably a rationale here. It would be interesting to know what it is. I'm not advocating a change in the boundary, but it'd be good to know how it came to be. And John, I know you're trying to speak, but your microphone was off.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm trying to keep myself muted to avoid background noise. That's right. As Sandra said, it was redone. The original basin boundary actually that was on DWR's website when they released the original Bulletin 118 boundaries for SGMA planning, had some sort of projection error and was actually way off the basin. And so we had to petition them to get that fixed. And I wasn't part of the fix. Sandra's just spoken to it. I'm not sure their rationale is going to be readily apparent and publicly available, but we'll try to look into it.
Okay.
Hey, John, Jim, this is Jim Bennett. I just wanted to comment on the discussion that we were having about the basin and the modeling effort, and just to clarify that the model would be extending beyond the basin boundaries to basically provide the right location for connecting the basin to the watershed in regard to recharge of the basin, but that in no way really changes the actual basin definition. It will be consistent with the DWR, basin, Bulletin 118 definition. The modeling is a separate effort that's attempting to model the water flow in and out of the basin, and that's why the model that you're describing has to go outside the basin. I just wanted to clarify that for the listeners.
Thanks, Jim.
This is Patsy. Before we go to the AC comments, Will Halligan, did you want to make your comment?
I was just gonna say that it's kind of two different topics as far as defining the basin versus accounting for flux between various units for water budget purposes. And I think we should probably be consistent to whatever DWR has as far as definition of the basin per se, but that doesn't necessarily mean the modeling effort and the technical analysis can't account for fluxes between various units between the alluvium, residuum, and fractured bedrock, et cetera, which I think Nate is, pretty much answered on the water budget end of things that will occur. So I think it's, I don't know, I think the responses are really good in that regard. So I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. I believe that I had noted down that we have 3 AC members, advisory committee members present today. So Frank, Matt Whitman, Ricky, do any of you have any comments on this agenda item?
Did Ricky join? I didn't see her.
Well, I've seen her come in and out and in and out.
Oh, okay. I will add you.
I'm here.
I have a bit of a concern. It appears to me that since I attended the last TPR meeting, there was a general concern about not including bedrock wells in the groundwater modeling process. And it seemed like the majority of the TPR committee was in favor of including bedrock wells. In addition, I'm aware that there were some letters of concern sent to, I guess, John Ayers, and we did not, as a participant or as a visual participant, we have not seen any of those letters addressed. And yet, magically, between the last meeting and this meeting, there seems to be a swing around, and it seems one of the consultants today is still not fully on board. And I just wanted to address that, or want to make it noted that there seems to be a mysterious turnaround in the decision of the TPR group regarding whether to follow Bulletin 118 or include the deep water wells, the groundwater wells, which have to date not been proven that they are not connected.
Mute myself again. So what we're doing here is following the formal definition established by the Water Code and what's in Bulletin 118. And we have the rest of the language about the data gap and a future investigation needed if we're going to do any sort of management. Because defining in, or even at this point, performing an inventory, all right, Kat, come on. Sorry about that. Performing an inventory of what wells are in the basin isn't, A, it isn't in our scope, and B, it's not required by SGMA. And so by doing it this way, and then still analyzing the basin as a whole, including that fractured bedrock, we'll get some insight based on the modeling analysis of those interactions and looking at vertical gradients like Matt has mentioned. We need to look at vertical gradients under the HCM or groundwater conditions anyways. That's a requirement. So we'll take a look at those. They're pretty connected. There is a slight downward gradient, but it's pretty darn small in the wells I've looked at. And so this is something that we feel we kind of need to park for now, wait till we have more information, and if needed, pursue more and better information simply so that we can continue on developing the plan. And yeah, that leaves this hanging out there in the open and kind of unaddressed. And that's by design. There's so many things you have to do in a GSP, from hydrogeology to land use to water budgets to setting thresholds and starting elaborate policy mechanisms, that things that aren't essentially required tend to get pushed back towards the implementation phase. And that's been what's happened in the 2020 GSPs. And one basin I've worked in particular, it's Kuyama. They're facing some really large irrigation cuts because their water budget came out where they need a huge cut. And they're still figuring out exactly what that looks like and who has to do the cutting. There was no way to do that with the amount of time available for plan preparation. And that's why we push those really challenging, elaborate decisions that affect people's livelihoods. We push those off till after the plan's developed so we can hit the regulatory or the legal requirement, the plan gets submitted, and still have a good faith effort for doing the management. And then when we do the management, because we're in the implementation phase and we don't have a hard deadline, we can have all the meetings necessary and do all the analysis necessary and collect additional data to improve that understanding so that we can make a better decision rather than not having that now.
This is Patsy. Will Halligan, did you want to respond to Frank Conine, or did you want to, or was yours more general?
Well, I was going to respond to Frank, I guess. I'm not quite sure which member he's referring to, but I think in my opinion, there's a basin definition, and whatever that ends up being, it is what it should be, as consistent probably to Bulletin 119, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't account for various stresses that have influences on the groundwater resources within the whatever basin definition you elect to use. Whether it's wells and bedrock or otherwise, accounting for all the stresses that can affect the groundwater resources is an important aspect of what should be probably looked at.
Okay,
assuming you have the data.
Yeah,
Assuming you have the data to be able to, do as good as you can. And then, like John said, there may be some things that have maybe higher uncertainties or other issues that you deal with in the implementation part.
Okay, thank you. Matt Whitman or Ricky, did you have a comment at this point, or can we go on to the next agenda item?
I have no comments.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. You go on to the next agenda item.
Thank you, Ricky. Okay, John.
Moving on, now we're looking for technical input on our approach, and we've got a number of slides about the numerical model and then a few slides about monitoring networks. And Nate, how do I give you control for the, there it is. I have given control to Nate. Make sure I got the mouse in the right spot. There you go. You need it over there. All right, go to town.
That's me moving, great. You probably figured it out based on my video. I have two screens, so I'm looking away at this other screen here to see what I'm doing. Let's see here. So starting off with the recommended modeling codes, in the January 2020 TPR meeting, we had preliminarily suggested two different codes. One was ModFlow Newt. Here, that's to solve the governing flow equations. And we were thinking MT3D USGS would be a good code for the solute transport model. With this process, the GSP, as everyone knows, this is a new legislation. A lot of what contractors and GSAs are doing right now is we're learning as we go. Since January, had the opportunity to kind of compare notes, if you will, with other contractors and GSAs that I'm involved with. Woodard Curran did as well. There's a number of GSPs that we're touching and our subs are touching throughout the state. And what we learned is nobody is doing solute transport model that we're aware of for this GSP for this first round. And it just kind of gave us pause. You know, it made us, I guess, double think, you know, whether doing solute transport modeling and potentially being the only one doing that when the regulations don't specifically require us to do that. So we took a look at that. Control back here. And yeah, again, they're not required. We're not aware of others that quite a few throughout the state that are not doing GSPs. And just start to think about solute transport modeling in general. I have a lot of experience with solute transport modeling, and I can say, you know, it's definitely much more data intensive. There's a lot more complex data sets, and you know, typically a lot of the information for solute transport models is just generally less available from a boundary condition standpoint. And as a result, when you compare solute transport modeling with just flow modeling, there's just inherently greater predictive uncertainty with those forecasts. And given that this is a regulatory document, not just like a feasibility study, but this is there's a lot more bearing on this type of a project. In our view, we're thinking it's best to not do solute transport modeling at this time for this GSP, and instead, for the water quality components, rely on some of those historical water quality trends, and then some of the simulations that have already been completed as part of that salt and nutrient management plan to kind of help guide decisions related to the sustainable, you know, management criteria and those types of things that are required in the GSPs. So that's our recommendation at this time, is to not do formal solute transport modeling, because it might raise more questions than answers. And ultimately, we want to provide model output that's helpful to make decisions for this GSP. In doing this, this actually frees up a little bit of funding for a couple of things. One is there were some climate evaluations that needed to be done that we hadn't originally scoped. And so that frees up some of that money to take care of that. And I have a few slides where I can describe that in more detail. And it also allows for just greater coordination. It's complicated enough looking at just the flow information in the model, and it allows kind of greater participation through this TPR process. So I can pause real quick if you have some questions on that before I move on. Basically, this has led us into selecting, proposing a different modeling code, but I can pause here for questions. Okay, well, let's move on. So the modeling codes out there, we looked at them, and in our view, this one water hydrologic flow model code is developed out of the San Diego shop of the USGS. Randy Hansen is the primary developer. That code it's definitely compliant with the regulations. You know, again, it's in the ModFlow family of codes, which are industry standards. They're in wide use, really well documented, good tech support. Some of the things that are important in this basin, particularly on the east side, is how the groundwater levels really respond a lot to recharge events, so that there can be large swings seasonally in groundwater levels. And so this code can handle that drying and rewetting of model layers very well. And it also incorporates this process here for this irrigation demand-driven land uses to estimate ag pumping. And that's really important for basins that have a history of, you know, ag use where we don't have measured flow rates. So we have to come up with a method to estimate those ag pumping flow rates. And so this code actually has a process, and I'm going to go through that in a little more detail in a minute, but it integrates a lot of the land use and cropping pattern and soils data in a way that can automatically, as part of the simulation, estimate ag pumping. And so I can talk about that more in a minute. It also has a lot of really convenient post-processing utilities that are really well suited for the GSPs. So we can pull out, efficiently the groundwater budgets, land water budgets, and surface water budgets. And those are all required by GSPs. So there's a lot of built-in tools to make that really efficient. So in our view, this is just a really good, it's publicly domain free code. So it meets all the requirements. So that's where we're headed at this point, using one water. Any questions on that?
Yeah, Nate, this is Will. We used one water for the Westlands or Westside Subbasin GSP, and it's a fairly complex code, and but yeah, it is nice in that it gives that ground surface budget along with the groundwater budget, and if you did have groundwater pumping data, then you can incorporate that as a calibration target as well to dial in your the development of groundwater pumping from the model itself.
Good. Yeah, thank you for that feedback. We've used the farm process, some of the predecessors to One Water. ModFlow Newt is just this latest version. It basically incorporates, ModFlow Newt, the farm process, the latest SFR, all these things. It's more integrated. So yeah, appreciate that feedback.
I would say, I would follow up with that though, that the one drawback with it is if in the future you're planning on folding in a solute transport element like a MT3D to get some of the output or the flux terms that you want from the ground surface budget to the groundwater budget for MT3D, you'll need to do some code enhancements. And so just, keep that in mind in case the solute transport modeling element is something that may want to be utilized, in the future. Although I agree with the approach of not doing it for GSP purposes, but in case the county or others want to utilize the model tool for other purposes besides for Sigma and would want to have a solute transport element, then you should consider that in that decision.
Yeah, I agree. Yes, good point. Yeah, the thinking there was we still have the salt nutrient management plan model, and perhaps it's best to handle, if the city wants to look at some more water quality things in the future, maybe it's best to leave that as a separate tool. But your point is exactly right. That's my understanding as well, that it is One Water is not compatible at this time with MT3D. That's a topic I've broached with the developers, and that is something they're aware of, and it is a consideration.
Yeah, we've actually developed some customization of that to allow that linkage to occur through the developers. So, but that is another topic that we don't need to digress in.
No, I appreciate it. It's probably good that they're hearing it from more than one contractor, so that's good. So maybe they'll actually get it done. But yeah, thank you. Let's see here. So land use, I mentioned that a moment ago. Still, there might be some benefit of just kind of talking through how land use is incorporated into the process. So with this graphic, at the heart of it is this farm process. And so this code that we use is modular. It has all these different packages that you can pull in, one of which is this farm process. And you can see I'm listing here all the different types of input data that feed it. You know, there's precipitation and ET. You have soils data, things like, you know, for a given soil type, what's the capillary fringe, those types of things. Irrigation efficiencies, you know, if you're using drip versus flood versus sprinkler, those all have different irrigation efficiencies. And then this linkage between land use and what we've opted to get is this Cal ETA, which is really an interesting data set. It provides you a full bleed. This is the model domain here, and it gives us a full bleed of information on 30-meter centers, the actual ET as derived from satellite imagery for the years that we've obtained here. So they already had done this work that this group is called Formation. We got, this is monthly data, by the way. 2010 through 2017 was a data set they had already processed and prepared and was readily available. So we got that. And then we also got 2 more annual slices, you know, at 2019 and 2005. But again, what this is showing is, you know, like in these orange areas, there was not much groundwater ET that occurred at that particular time, whereas the green areas, there was a lot of, you know, more ET. So you get an actual ET rate that we can associate with crops during these times. So the land use data becomes really important because we can link actual consumptive use, actual groundwater ET to specific crops. And with that, we can estimate out more defensible crop coefficients with which to apply during the years where we don't have the California ET data. So that's what I meant by sort of the ag pumping needs to satisfy this ET that has actually occurred based on the inputs that we include here for it to estimate an ag pumping component. So it's pretty powerful from that perspective. This all, you know, package along with other packages feeds the numerical flow model, and then ultimately the flow model is what generates these time series water balances. So that's kind of how land use fits into the big picture with this particular tool. Any questions on that? Okay. So some thoughts on the calibration period. Some of the considerations are the GSP regulations. First and foremost, they require at least the most recent 10 years are included. So roughly, you know, 2010 through to 2020. And we want to think about what's the reliability of some of the input data we're going to need, you know, over the recent past. And then also, are we including enough climate variability with whatever period we select? So these are some of the factors leading into coming up with a calibration period. And I had mentioned on a previous slide that there was some climate work that had needed to be done that we didn't originally scope. And it has to do with this right here. There were no water year indices developed for the San Pasqual Valley. So just for reference, in the Central Valley, we have, you know, the San Joaquin and Sac Valleys, DWR puts out, you know, wet above normal. They actually have a below normal, dry and critical. So a very similar set of indices. And we needed to establish that for this as part of the GSP because the water budgets need to be reported, and we need to provide ranges of water budget terms for these different water year types. So this needed to be done. We completed that analysis out of the San Diego shop of Jacobs. We looked at, you know, precipitation data and came up with rankings and went through the process of developing these for the valley. And so, let's see here, there we go. And so from that, we came up with this water year indexing. So what I'm showing here is a bar chart of annual precipitation through time. This is looking at a 40-year period. And I want to note these are in water years. So these are based on October 1st through September 30th of the following calendar year. Let's see, the dashed line here is an average annual over this period, so about 14.5 inches of precipitation. and they're colored based on the water year index here. And I've also included just the acronyms here just to help us look at the plots. So one thing you look at right away is, okay, if the regs require the last 10 years, minimally, this is what we're looking at. So you can kind of get a sense of what kind of climatic variability have we seen over the last 10 years in this basin. And we start to think about, well, what's the benefit of, what if we were to include a few more years? Again, this is the minimum for compliance. And you can see by dragging it another 5 years, it gives some more opportunity to look at a couple of different water year types. And so this table I'm showing here is just showing kind of a count of each of the water year types that occurs, if we were just looking at a 10-year calibration period versus a 15-year. And then just for reference, this whole 40-year I'm showing at the bottom here. And in looking at this variability, there's a couple things to balance here. The farther you go back in time, the less reliable the data get. And so put it another way, the more we have to make educated guesses on some of those inputs. So we like to stay on the more recent end of things. Also from a SGMA compliance, GSP compliance, they only require at least 10 years. And so model run times, a lot more model assumptions, poorer land use information as you go farther back in time. So in our view, when you kind of balance all these things, we're thinking that, by extending this minimum requirement by 50%, we include these additional 5 years, it does a couple of things for us. One is with the 10-year, there was only one opportunity to kind of put the model through its paces to see how it does in a dry condition, for example. By extending another 5 years, each of these categories, we have a couple of opportunities to kind of check the model against that water year type. And an extra 5 years, it adds some burden. It's going to make models take slower, longer to run, bigger files to manage. It kind of slow things down. But I think there's benefit there of including a little bit more variability here. Also, the groundwater level data really pretty much 2008 and forward in terms of just the better quality groundwater level data that we have. So that's the other thing, data reliability. So anyway, at this point, we're proposing this 15-year period, and which is why in the previous slide I had shown that those actual ET data, we got a 2005, a 2007, there's kind of this middle period, and then at 2019, it was meant to kind of bracket this particular 15-year period. Any questions on that?
Nate, Will Halligan has a question.
Okay. So Nate, did you, I have a couple. So the first one is, did you do a cumulative departure for the main analysis on this rainfall data?
There was a lot of analyses, and that was one of them, yes.
So with that, how do these, you have the recommended 2005 to 20 period and the other ones, how does that relate to the cumulative departure as far as, is that overall period represent, long-term annual average, or is it generally wet or generally dry?
It's a little drier. It's on the drier side. Yeah, you can kind of visually even see that as you look at this. You kind of go back, way back here in the 80s, you've got, more of the cooler colors. You just tend to get more precip back in here. And then if you just kind of fix your eye in more recent time, you see kind of more warmer colors, which are drier and critical and normal in more recent time. But that's quite a ways back.
Right. No, I was just, I've always tried to pick a relatively horizontal line on the cumulative departure curve, when you go from a downward sloping to a downward sloping kind of endpoints, to to kind of select a period, also keeping in mind like what you mentioned as far as data availability, and so there's that balance, and so I would say if it's an overly dry period, or based on that, I would say as you go forward with interpreting your historical water budget results and things like that, you'll probably want to keep that in mind as a potential influence on what your water budget results turn out to be.
Yep, good point.
This is Peter. Yeah, it would be good to see the cumulative departure curve, because you would hope to include both a wet and a dry period and end near the mean for the period. And this does, I mean, if you look at your chart, it looks like over the long period, we have pretty even distribution in your 5 bins. And the period you're selecting does emphasize, a little bit the dry years. And, the basin is filled up in these wet years in the past. It's one of the features of the basin. So we don't want to be too pessimistic. We don't want to be thinking about the future.
There are no other questions, and maybe these next few slides, I kind of provided a couple extra slides that may not be necessary, but I'll just quickly say, these bars, they represent PRISM data. I just wanted to talk really quickly about the thought process we went through of which precipitation data sets to use. I'll move through this quickly. So here's a map that just shows the local precipitation stations. Over here, we've got the San Diego airport that by far has the most complete record and is relied on for all kinds of studies, hydrologic studies in the San Diego area, 100% covered since '39. Closer to the basin in the model domain is shown as this yellow line here relative to the basin boundary. And you can see there's only a couple of gauges actually in the model domain, one at the safari park that stopped recording in 2010. And then there's a SGMA station that has been recording only since about 2000 or 1999. Other than that, there's just a couple of gauges in the Ramona area on Poway, but you can see their coverages aren't as good out there. But so that's just what the availability of rain gauges look like spatially and temporally. In addition to that, we have PRISM. Here's the acronym here. I'm assuming the technical folks are familiar with this data set. It's put together by Oregon State's climate group. So there's some good science behind it, and it's in pretty wide use. I think a lot of modelers are using these data sets. And it takes the precipitation station data and it applies it through an algorithm that accounts for topography and rain shadows and all kinds of stuff to come up with an aggregated estimate on 4 kilometer centers. So each of these blocks is roughly 4 kilometers. You come up with an estimate of either daily precipitation or monthly dating way back. And so they provide nice continuous data sets that assimilate a lot of actual precip gauge data, but also incorporates lay of the land, if you will, topography and orographic effects. So that's the data set that I showed on that previous bar chart. And I want to put into context just, well, how does the PRISM data relate to the local rain gauge data? So I'm showing precipitation here, again, by water year over that same period. This is the safari park here in orange and the SGMA station. And there's 2 things we like to look at from a climate perspective. One is just the interannual variability, year to year. How does it look with some of the available data? And you can see here that the highs and lows correlate really well between PRISM and the local data. You can see here the SGMA station is lower, but again, at least the highs and lows seem to correspond pretty well with the PRISM data. And the reason the SIMA station is lower is because it's down in the valley, whereas this PRISM grid weighted data is representative of the whole model domain. So, but generally speaking, year to year here, it looks quite good. There's good correlation. And then the last slide I have here is just if you're wanting to also look at, well, how do they compare on a long-term average? So I pulled up their 30-year precipitation normals, which are just averages. And I'm showing all the different rain gauges relative to the PRISM gauge here. And again, the animal park here, Safari Park, you know, if you kind of fix your eye on about 14 on a long-term average basis, that also seems to compare pretty well to a gauge that we have kind of in the middle of the basin. So it's kind of through that thought process and thinking about the GSP process where we have to eventually incorporate climate change. You know, the PRISM data seems to, you know, represent the local conditions pretty well. And the nice thing with PRISM is there's also processes to incorporate climate change into those data sets. It's already established. So there's some convenience there as well. And so that's what we're planning to use as our source of precip for the model. I think that's my last slide, if there's any questions on that.
Let me unmute myself. So our next subject is monitoring networks. Just have a couple of slides here. Oh, I can see my text. That's neat. So for the monitoring networks, we've got to cover the 6 sustainability indicators. And just cutting to the chase, because this is the technical peer review and you guys are familiar with this stuff. The approach here that we'd like to run by you is monitoring levels and quality being TDS and nitrate, and then use levels as a proxy for storage, subsidence, and surface water depletion. Seawater intrusion is obviously not applicable. And the reason we want to do that is there's already a robust levels and quality monitoring network in place. The city's been doing it since about 2005. And so we have a long period of record, and we have water quality data for other constituents from that monitoring that we can use to present the case to the regulators that those other constituents aren't a concern. Storage is obviously similar to levels unless you have a major confined aquifer, which we do not. No stakeholder has mentioned any indicator of existing subsidence. I've not seen anything in literature about it. And so we're of the belief subsidence is not occurring, and we can use levels as a threshold for that as well, rather than having the people in the basin build, you know, extensometers or CGPS stations, that sort of thing. And then surface water depletion is not directly measurable and is calculated by the numeric model. It's not something you can directly set thresholds on anyways. What we will do is look at the model to see what it estimates that the depletions are and consider that as part of our levels threshold setting. And again, that's mostly because of implementation costs, control considerations, and honestly, that's just what's needed here. Is not, we don't need to monitor every single thing because the basin's in decent shape and it's not in complete crisis like say Kern or San Joaquin subbasins are. So what I'm showing here is the existing wells that are monitored for levels that we have data on. You'll note that the 2 new wells aren't on this map yet. We'll have that. They'll be added to it and become part of the network moving forward. We haven't decided, for the record here, we haven't decided to use all the wells on the figure. You know, all the Rancho Quejito wells are here. We don't need this many wells in one location. Some of those were aquifer test wells. So Peter, we'd like to work with you to pick a couple for monitoring. And I don't know if it's possible, but if you have access to another monitoring site up here, that would help the GSP understand levels in the northern part of there. You know, we have wells up here in this other finger and things like that. So in general, the levels network is pretty robust, has a pretty long period of record. It's monitored by the city regularly. So we'll refine it a little bit, but this is the gist of what it'll look like. And then the same sort of thing for quality is that the city monitors 10 sites. I have a couple extra ones in here that have some historical data, and they cover, again, majority of the basin. So these are the overall monitoring network. The representative network will be slightly smaller, and that is the monitoring network's approach. We'd like to go start preparing this part of the GSP, which is why we're talking about it now, because next time we meet, we'll be talking thresholds. And that's what I have for the monitoring networks. I'll go back to the rationale slide for the discussion, just because that makes sense to me. Any comments from TPR?
Yeah, Will Halligan, I think, has a comment at this point in your slides.
Yeah, John, was there any, on the subsidence part, is there any, have you looked at either satellite data to get a sense of historical occurrence and or if there's any UNAVCO ground-based stations that are in the valley?
Haven't been able to find either of those.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Sure.
John, there is an observation well in the middle to north part of Rockwood that goes down into the DG. It's dry at this point. It's been dry for quite a few years, but we could continue to report that it's dry and help conserve water levels.
Is that Peter speaking?
Yes.
Depending on how deep that is, that might be worth doing, assuming that it's at least a data point.
Yeah, it's 100 feet deep.
Yeah, that'd be worth adding, just as something to consider moving forward.
Is that a monitoring well?
Yeah.
This is Nate, and does that go back a ways? Was there a point in time when it wasn't dry that we have data?
Yeah, it had a few feet of water in it when we first built it. The domestic well also went dry back up there.
That actually would be that would be helpful. That whole time history, not just where it's located, but you know the transition of when that became dry. That can still serve as a decent you know one-sided target in the model, just to make sure water levels are at least below that point in that area.
Hi, this is Matt. Matt Weedland. Looking at this map, I'm struck by the absence of monitoring wells in the area that's north of Santa Maria Creek. We've got about a 2-mile stretch between well 19 and well 154 where there's no monitoring going on, and we have extensive agricultural operations, which implies that there's probably extensive groundwater pumping going on there. So, John, what can you tell us about what we know about water wells out there? Or I guess I was a little surprised to hear that we haven't done any kind of well inventory effort for the basin. So maybe you don't know.
So we have gone through all the well completion reports, and we've put together a spreadsheet with data from them. But as you know, location information on those things is not good and not direct and not efficient to process. And so, yes, there are wells in that general area, but we don't know if they're pumping or not. we generally know how deep they are. We don't know exactly where they are either from the well completion reports. You know, we looked at APN parcels if they had it, street addresses if they had it, and then township range sections. But getting further than that requires, you know, spending a lot of time with the poorly hand scribbled map and trying to figure out where that is with the aerial and whatnot. And you'll find that for the cross section, our geologic subconsultant did that. And so we have a lot of wells located on the cross section. But they're not monitoring wells, and the density of monitoring wells in this basin far exceeds the recommendation under SGMA, which is 1 per 10 square miles. That said, this is kind of a gap, and what I'd like to do is identify it as a data gap that the GSA would like to fill, so that the GSA can move forward to either find a replacement or find a well in that area that's already existing, or drill a new one and, you know, pursue grant funding to do those sorts of things, because it would be nice to have some additional monitoring there. But I don't think it invalidates the plan in the meantime.
Nate, do you have any thoughts about that area in terms of your modeling?
Do I have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm referring to, do you know where the area I'm talking about, where there's really no groundwater level monitoring going on?
Yes, I see it. I mean, yeah, I mean, I like data. You know, it's a kind of it's a balance, right? So I see what you're saying. There's an open area there where, you know, it'd be nice to have some information. But yeah, I guess as part of the GSP process, and John can speak better to this than I, you know, there's going to be an evaluation of adequacy of monitoring network, and, you know, that to some extent will be looked at again. I don't know, John, if you have thoughts on that, but yeah, I acknowledge that there looks to be some real estate there without a target for the model.
Right. A follow-up question for you, John, is that in the water quality monitoring, there's a few wells that are included for water quality monitoring that aren't included for groundwater level monitoring. For instance, there is one along Santa Maria Creek. Is there, I mean, people are going out and collecting groundwater samples. One would presume that you could get a water level from them, but, you know, perhaps there's a probe access issue there. I mean, Sandra, do you guys know why those couldn't be incorporated into the water level monitoring program?
So just to back up a quick bit, the water quality network are wells that aren't the city's wells, that are either leaseholders or other, and that are, in general, there's a pump in them that runs, and they can come out there and take the sample directly from the pump. And so this is a separate network from the levels network, as I understand it. Is that correct, Sandra?
There's actually one well that's in common between we have a separate division that goes out to sample the water quality. We could possibly ask them to do the water level. You would think that would be a nice idea. It's not as simple as it sounds, and then we have another division that samples water levels. There's one well in common between the two.
Yeah, you know, without knowing whether or not, I see there's two issues here. One is a property rights issue and an agreement, and the other is whether there's physical access. And I don't know if anyone's ever looked at that, and whether anyone's willing.
No, we have.
Yeah.
It takes a long time to change things at the city, so that's an excellent recommendation. We can definitely look into that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say we'll put into the plan that we've identified that area, and honestly, the area to the left of that. I have a pointer, so here-ish and over here-ish as data gaps that we'd like to get filled, but they're not. But rather than call them critical overdrafts that must get filled, which is potentially a burden to the people in the basin, we're going to say, hey, these are nice to haves, and that would improve understanding overall. But we feel like we're okay in general. It is the approach I'd like to take.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that. Thanks, John.
Sure. We're out to advisory committee comments, and then I think we might want to take a break after this for restrooms.
Yes, I was just corresponding with Emily, and so we'll take 5 minutes after the AC comments. I know that Frank, you had entered a couple of questions, one at 10:07 and one at 10:13. So do you want to ask those now, or did they get answered in the course of the course? I can see Frank, but you're muted, I think. We can't hear you, Frank. Okay.
There you go. You're back.
Okay, I'm back. I'm sorry. I double-clicked. So the source for the data, the second question, that got completely answered. I completely understand it. It's really cool. I track precipitation myself over here, and I would say that it all matches in really close. I have one small issue, the sigma station, and the correlation is tight enough that I don't think it matters, but I would point out that sigma station, I think when it was originally installed, was installed inside of a cow pasture where there was no irrigation or very limited irrigation, and now that sigma station is in an irrigated field, and so you wonder about, is there any contamination of the information provided? But the correlation seems so tight that I don't think so. So that answered the second question. And then if I go back up to the first question, based upon the description of the modeling that you were using, that modeling will also incorporate irrigation returns from the different types of crop use and the different types of irrigation methods. Correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Then that covers everything I had right there.
Okay, and Matt Whitman, you wanted to know something about the Simmons station?
No, Frank was referring to a Sigma station, and I'm sure he was saying it was more Simmons, but I do have a comment. And in all this historical data, you know, we had this discussion at the previous meeting about the land use maps, and in whatever kind of historical modeling we have, the importance of any assumptions on groundwater use based on cropping types are completely at the whim of those maps of what types of crops were grown in the valley. So I guess I would caution, without more accurate information on how many acres of what kind of crops, the validity of some kind of those assumptions.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's take a 5-minute break. By my clock, it is now 10:38. So that means we'll start again at what, 10:43, roughly? Okay, we'll be back. Okay, I think we're back. It's being 10:43. Hopefully we're all set to go again. John, are you back again?
I am back. I noticed a few of our other folks still aren't, but I am here.
How can you tell if they're not here?
Like Rosalind's not in her video, it shows an empty seat.
I see.
And
I'm
Matt
back.
Whelan had his video off and Will was away from his seat, so I can sense Rosalind's about to be back. All right, undesirable results, preliminary analysis. We've got some extra figures to share. So in this section, we're gonna go over undesirable results narratives, review some figures we've got put together. As usual at these TPR meetings, just talking about figure contents or, figure formatting probably isn't the ideal use of our time. So feel free to send us comments on these figures later if you don't feel comfortable doing so now, or you can't see them on the screen. That's what we have the handouts for, sort of help facilitate that. And the goal with this part of the presentation outside of the undesirable results is just to, look, we made a thing. Be sure to look at it. That sort of stuff. So we're gonna have all the figures in handout 3. We're gonna go over the undesirable results, geologic map, contour maps, surface water flows and quality, and then the cross sections. So undesirable result in Sigma is in essence two things. One is you write these narratives up about what happens if conditions are bad for local users, i.e., if we get to an undesirable result, quote unquote, what does that look like? Are we dewatering wells? Are we ruining groundwater dependent ecosystems? Have we hit the bottom of the basin? What is bad? And then the second version here is when you detect or measure and get an undesirable result, quote unquote, through monitoring and being below minimum thresholds. And so what we're going to spend the bulk of our time on is the first one, although I do have a slide about the second one towards the end, and we definitely want some input on that as we move it forward. So these narratives or statements and how they're detected are key components of the GSP, right? We have to establish a monitoring network to be able to monitor the sustainability indicators to avoid undesirable results. We set our minimum thresholds so that below them is when the undesirable result is occurring. We set our projects and management actions to avoid those thresholds and to make sure things are sustainable to stay out of undesirable results. So getting these statements right and having them written in a particular way is really important. And I like to think of the statements kind of like in an environmental impact report, where you're phrasing what the project is. When you write the project statement a certain way, you can influence which alternative is picked because the project has phrased, this is what we want to do, this is why, and this is how. And so we want to make sure our undesirable result statements give us the flexibility to do the management at the local level and still meet those regulatory requirements so that a regulator will approve the plan. So Last time we talked about collecting stakeholder input. We've done that. And we use those as input into the statement. Again, the statements are broadly phrased and they drive all the stuff I just talked about. So you have a copy of the matrix in the handout, and the matrix, everything in here is in essence a stakeholder input from the advisory committee meeting affecting downstream's neighbors or affecting the viability of agriculture or the agricultural economy. Don't strand, i.e. dry out groundwater wells, and so on and so forth. And so what we did is we looked at these. We wanted to make sure our undesirable result statements allowed us to consider these things while setting thresholds in our sustainable management criteria. So for example, for groundwater levels, the undesirable result for the chronic lowering of groundwater levels is a result that causes significant and unreasonable reduction in the long-term viability of domestic agricultural, municipal, or environmental uses over the planning and implementation horizon of the GSP. And the reason we keep all those words in there is they give us flexibility. Chronic lowering of groundwater levels is the official SGMA terminology around that, but chronic is important. It means you have to be going down over an extended period of time. Significant and unreasonable reduction. Significant and unreasonable is not defined in the regs or the law, and it is intended to give us flexibility at the local management level. And then we went with the long-term viability so that we're not beholden to addressing singular event type things. If there's one particularly awful year, that doesn't kick us into an undesirable result and thus having to interact with the state board. And then we went with domestic agriculture, municipal, or environmental uses as the catch-all terms for potential uses of groundwater in the basin. And so we have statements for the 6 sustainability indicators in the handout. What we don't have a statement for is seawater intrusion. Instead, we have an exclusionary statement that our basin is not near any bays, seas, estuaries, or inlets. So any comments on the undesirable result narratives at this time? Again, remember, you can always do it later in writing. But this is our overall approach, and the other undesirable results are somewhat similar to this one. I'm not hearing any. Moving on. So that second part of how the undesirable result is detected is based on monitoring. And what we're familiar with is, a certain percentage of your representative monitoring wells go below the minimum threshold for groundwater, and we're still sticking to groundwater level. And so there's 2 parts to this. One is, what is the percent we want to use, i.e. how many wells out of the network, and then how many years in a row. Now, SGMA doesn't say that it has to be a single year or it can be multiple years. But we've done this in other GSPs I've worked on. And the reason I like 2 or more years, and I went with 2, but this is up for discussion, is that in a year where you do have 1 or 2 or multiple exceedances below the minimum threshold, the GSA needs time to figure out if those are real. Is that just a bad measurement? Is it a change in local conditions? Maybe someone's installed a giant new agricultural well nearby. Did the well physically have a problem? Is it collapsed or something along those lines? Or is there other things at work? Is it all just one bad dry year? So when you get those first hits below the minimum threshold, it gives the GSA time to investigate. And so that if there's 2 years in a row, the GSA is ready to really leap into action. And so while my typical approach here would be to use something between 25 and 35% of the representative monitoring wells, which will probably be somewhere between 4 and 5 wells in this basin. Definitely wanted to seek input from TPR folks on this. What's worked for you elsewhere? Is there some aspects we want to consider that we haven't? Those sorts of things.
John,
think,
this is, oh,
right.
Go ahead, Matt.
This sounds pretty good to me. I would think 30%. If you have one well, which is always below the minimum threshold, you have to revisit whether the minimum threshold is appropriate, because that would seem to be a triggering effect. But this is pretty consistent with what we've done. I think 2 years is good, maybe 3. I think this is pretty reasonable.
Great, thanks.
Will Halligan, you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to echo what Peter just said, John, as far as this seems to be a pretty common approach in the GSPs that we've done in the critically overdrafted basins, as far as picking a percent, whether it's, I would say most commonly it's like 25 or 30, and for 2 or 3 years.
John, Matt Wheatland here. That seems reasonable to me.
Great. Thanks, guys. Moving on. Whoa. So what we're going to do now is go over some preliminary analysis results, more figures. As you know, GSPs make a ton of figures. So one of the comments we got previously was about just showing the 2 geologic maps together, which was pretty much a graphics operation. You'll note that they don't perfectly match, and that is because each map was mapped by a different USGS team, had a completely different set of authors. And so some of their interpretations about the granite or the granodiorite don't perfectly align. The good news is their basin materials, the alluvium for the most part matches great. And so those align. And what we're planning to do in the report will be to have these both together and probably separate and more zoomed in, and then have the keys from both maps for that purpose. So we've included a couple of groundwater elevation contour maps. We've got 2015 and 2018. I'll be honest, I really wanted to have 4 of these ready for this meeting. And my staff had a little trouble trying to get GIS to do it, so we ended up hand contouring a lot of this, and we just didn't have the other 2 maps ready yet. That'll be fall of 2014 and fall of 2018. And the reason we did fall of 14 and spring of 2015 is to have values close to that January 1, 2015 mark. And then we just did 2018 because there was a lot of monitoring and it was nearby. We also have figures showing depth to water. So that since the basin itself changes 180 feet from one end to the other, it's nice to know how far groundwater is from the surface in different parts. And so what we've got here are just the points. We didn't contour this because changing, the ground surface elevation changes. If you try and map it exactly, you pretty much just show ground surface elevation if you try to contour it, or you're making a lot of big assumptions. So we wanted to include these because they provide another aspect of data that's useful.
John, just real quick, I noticed that the monitoring well up by Highway 78 near Cloverdale Creek, I happen to be familiar with that data set. I had a project near there. Groundwater elevation isn't right on that. Your depth looks right, so I think the reference point elevation is wrong on it. Same with the next elevation map you have, so just a heads up.
We're talking about this guy way up here.
That's, no, hold on.
This one?
That one. The one that says elevation 347.
Okay.
By about 9 feet.
All right, yeah, because it's 9 feet in the next one.
No, I'm just saying that the groundwater elevation is in error by about 9 feet, but the depth to water is correct on it.
Okay. Yeah, we'll try to get that corrected.
Yeah.
All right. So one thing we took a look at is the city monitors for quality on surface water streams at a number of locations. And you can see them on here. The blue ones are inside the basin and the orange ones are outside and upstream of Lake Hodges. So we didn't plot the data from those. What these plots show, and I think we made it so it zooms in, although it's a little granular. Let's see here. Yeah. So what these plots show is time across the bottom, the concentration of the constituent, and it's either nitrate or TDS, nitrate this figure, TDS the next, and then stream flows and CFS across the bottom. Now, the stream flow measurements that were made at these stations are not continuous. They're usually seemingly tied in with sampling events. So there's periods where there's missing data. And all we're really trying to do is get some idea of if the concentrations have changed over time at these stations or if they're tied into stream flows. So if I go back here, we can see there's some tie-in here, but it's really, we don't really know much about that one. So the nitrate doesn't seem very connected to flows, even if there's like a little spike here. We just can't come to a conclusion on that. When we look at total dissolved solids, we do see some changes around the big flow events like 2011 here. But again, nothing too concrete here. This data set also had a lot of strangely low readings that didn't make sense, so we've omitted them from the figure. Like out here, there were some like 0.25 TDS results, and that just didn't seem real at all, so we scrubbed those. So we have this information, and what's interesting is in our groundwater quality, we've got more challenges in this area, and we see that Cloverdale Creek and Santa Maria Creek, have some spikes in their TDS and in their nitrate. So there may be some sort of connection between the inflow with the conditions in the basin. We're not entirely sure yet. So those will be things we have to consider while setting thresholds, even if we don't have a perfect understanding of cause, and effect. We can at least look at those and consider them as part of the story.
John, one thing that crossed my mind, and this is Matt Wheatland, some of these TDS spikes, particularly the large ones, it crossed my mind, might there have been wildfire in the watershed prior to a wet season or something like that? And I haven't taken a look to see when these wildfires happen, but just something else to keep in the back of your head.
Yeah, that would make sense with that particularly huge set of spikes, especially on this Cloverdale Creek one at the end. It's like 4,000 TDS. That's kind of crazy. There's that all zoomed in. We also have streamflow data from the USGS. They're not actually in the basin, but they're on tributaries heading in, and so we've got we've averaged them by month here. These were continuous data, so we just wanted to. This figure is really to show that we have this data. We're giving it to Nate for model use, or Nate already has it one way or the other. We already gave it to him. Some coordination has or will occur about that, and you can see, hey, it flows in the winter typically and not in the summer across all three. And I'm not really surprised by that, to be honest. So moving on to my favorite part.
Real quick on that one, John. So those three charts represent the same stream gauge, but you're just presenting it in different units, or is that some kind of typo in the stream gauge ID number?
That is definitely a typo in the title bar, and I can't believe I missed that of each of those figures. That should have been one for each of the stations.
Okay. All right. Well, now you got it.
Yeah, now I'm curious if this is all the same thing with just different color. I don't know what's going on. So something for us to take care of and fix for next time.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, so you'll remember that old DWR cross section that goes down the spine of the valley. One of the things we wanted to do for the GSP was to make new cross sections, and we've got those based off of well completion reports. And so what our sub-consultant's done, Scott Snyder, is he worked his way through the well completion reports and actually figured out the siting for a number of wells. And so these are the transect lines of the different cross sections. And so away we go. So this is the cross section. The long one here is AA prime, which is down the spine of the valley. And so you can see where all the wells were. And he also plotted on groundwater surface from spring of 2015, just to kind of help us get a little perspective there that depth to water maybe isn't an indicator of a problem over on mouse. There we go. Over here, because the groundwater levels have stayed flat here. So in instance, and it was something we're going to talk about later, not necessarily, we don't have to decide today, but this is a pretty flat gradient for the groundwater levels. We've got deeper depths to water here, but that might be okay because that's where the groundwater is. And if we got raised it higher, it would just flow out that way anyway. So moving on, we've got the B3 prime one, which is over at Cloverdale Canyon, and we only have a few wells there. And we've decided to keep dashed lines for the residuum and the bedrock because a lot of times these are inferred, and this is from well completion reports, whereas drillers typically called out residuum as decomposed granite and bedrock as bedrock. Not all of them did, and so we had to make some calls in there. Moving on. So these are the last two. And Peter, I am sure you are far more knowledgeable about the subsurface geology in Cajito Creek or Rockwood Canyon than we are. So if you have suggestions or ways to improve that stretch of our cross section, we're all ears. And then C is the one that goes to Santa Margarita and across the center. And so what these do is they give us a general idea of how deep the alluvium is, some ballpark estimates of how deep the residuum is. So these will be useful for not to put words in Nate's mouth, but they'll be useful for setting up the model construction. So we have a pretty good estimate of where the alluvium, the residuum, and the bedrock is. And then this, of course, will go in our HCM section to help describe the geology of the basin.
John, Matt Weedland here again. I do have a couple comments on the cross sections. One thing that struck me is the elevation of bedrock contact in the center of cross section A at well 00509, really shallow, and seems like if you were to take that and incorporate that into the groundwater model, you're going to have really low transmissivity there, and it might be worth just taking a second look at that well log and trying to get an assessment of whether or not that's real or not. Along those same lines, interestingly enough, last time we met, you had a map that was a regional map that showed fault coming out of Santa Maria Creek, which may or may not line up with that big bump there. And it might be worth taking a look at that. And I don't know what the source of information was for that fault, because it doesn't show up on the San Pasqual geologic map, but just something to consider there. Lastly, with the monitoring wells where we have nested completions, I think it would be useful to show those completions and indicate where we have a vertical gradient, even though it's, like you said before, it's small, but it's useful to demonstrate that we have some knowledge of vertical gradients in certain locations along the cross section.
Yeah, that's great feedback, and we'll definitely look into verifying that LWell 000509 data, and I'll talk with Scott about adding the perforations to the wells in the cross sections.
Thanks.
If you'll allow me to interject, this is Frank Conine. Being the leaseholder on that area for that 00509 well, there is not a well in that location. There is and so that's why I'm also, that data point is extremely skewed. I'm not going to disagree that there may be some type of a dam area near Isabel Creek Road, but this is where the location of that 509 well is. There's not a well to my knowledge. I have a well that is significantly to the north of that point. And if they were using that, my existing well, as a data point, the reason it'd be skewed is my well would be more of a lateral supply to the solid east and west line rather than a point on the east and west line. Did that make sense?
Right, your well's further north than this line. I think I'm not sure. We'll look into this well for sure. Between your and Matt's comments, there's a lot to look into there. I think one of the challenges here is this is near that saddle part of the basin. That what we need to do is show the basin boundary on this figure to help. There's the two rivers joining, but there's essentially that saddle part of bedrock out here, and it's kind of close to that. And so I'm wondering if it skews things, and if this line went down here, we'd see less of a barrier to flow over there. So I'll work with our with Scott and see if we can sort that out a little better.
The only other thing, I'm just going through my memory right now. The only other thing is recently there was an attempt to put a well there, and maybe that came from some county data where we attempted to put a well there and they came with a dry hole. But that would be the second part of that information. That's also a dry hole if that was the attempted well that was drilled, say, 5 years ago, 6, 7 years ago.
Yeah, we'll definitely look into this one.
Hey, John,
and then I'm asking a couple questions. If I could back up one more.
This is Patsy. We need to, Frank, we need to wait for just another few minutes. And John, I want to remind you that it's 11:12 now. We're supposed to stop at 11:30.
All righty.
Perhaps you can get with Frank later on those issues.
Yeah, that would be nice, actually. Frank, I'll reach out after the meeting to plumb your local knowledge about that and see if we can come up with something a little more accurate for that area. That type of input is why we hold these meetings, to be honest. This is the old DWR cross section, and surprise, surprise, it looks kind of similar up to and even kind of including that more shallow spot, although ours is more pronounced. So we'll definitely look into that further. We've already talked about that. And I believe we are, oh, we have a field program update and then we're done. So any advisory committee?
Are there any other comments, Frank or Matt, at this point? Because we need to move along.
I would like to add a comment. Matt Whitman.
Go ahead, Matt. You go first.
In regard to your threshold statement, I guess there is a much more stability in the water levels historically on the west end versus the east end. I would caution you against using a number 30%, 35% of the wells. I would certainly be happier with it 25% or even lower if we're counting, because the wells, depending on how many wells you use as to do the math. And likewise with the frequency that the groundwater changes on that end of the basin, I think any longer than 2 years in the analysis would be a mistake. That's all.
Thanks for the input, Matt.
This is Frank Conine. On your, I believe it might be your slide 40, ours 39, the USGS stream gauges, the chart that's all screwed up because you show the 3 stream gauges, but the bar graphs all refer to a single stream gauge. I think it would be highly relevant also if we had a side note of the watershed that supplied each of those stream gauges. I know that you have this same chart or a similar version of this chart in the advisory committee meeting for this afternoon, and I was noticing that you're showing an average, but we don't know, is that an average over 1 year, over how many years, how many acres or square miles feed that stream gauge, and we'll leave it at that.
We've got the time period, but not the watershed above it. Obviously, this needs to be redone because something's really wrong.
John, okay, I've got Matt Wheatland here. I got 2 comments. One more pertaining to the cross sections, and then one regarding stream gauging. With these cross sections, in most cases, these wells are generally completed in one geologic unit, but in some cases, particularly in, well, let's just say in some cases when they penetrate into deeper rock, they may be completed possibly in deep rock and perhaps in alluvium or not. And it would be worth noting if they are completed in multiple units to show that. And then with regard to the stream gauging information, so seems like we got a pretty good handle on stream flow coming into the basin, but we don't have a handle on water leaving the basin, which is pretty important. What are your thoughts on how you guys are going to look at that?
Nate, you want to take that one on?
No, that's the elephant in the room for sure. Not having a reliable stream gauge on the exhaust point of the basin, that's a limitation. And so there's no way to go back in time and collect that. But that, yeah, there are some previous studies also based on modeling that we're internally going to look to. Eastern Hill did a regional study. I can't remember if it was HEC HMS or what was used, but we may need to look to some other just regional studies and just kind of have to be qualitative at this point because yeah, there is not good solid data on the effluent end of the basin.
Okay. Sandra, you might know the answer to this, but in my limited experience of working with other basins that are connected to reservoirs, the folks managing those reservoirs had estimates of surface water inflow into their reservoirs, and perhaps Lake Hodges has the same. I think that's somewhat complicated by the fact that we've got more than one stream flowing into Lake Hodges, but that might be a source of information that someone else has at least started the work on for you guys. Sandra, do you know Have you ever looked at Lake Hodges hydrology data?
No, I have not.
No.
Okay. Sandra?
This is Sandra. I know the city's been working on that quite extensively, so I can check to see what data is available.
So that might be something to work with.
All right.
That's it.
Field program update. And we're up against it on time, so I might fly through this a little bit. But the two new monitoring wells are shown here on the map, SP-128, SP-129. And you can see where they are. We've put in some aerial photos about the locations for the two of them here. Come on, mouse. There we go. TPR members will find this a little boring, but this part is really great for folks who aren't geologists. So on the left here, we've got the drill rig installing the well, and you can see them, the guy looking up next to the drill rig's right over the hole there. And then after the well's drilled, they lower in 3 sets of casing. And what you can see on here is we've got the 3 pipes. This one is slotted in this part, and these 2 are not, which means they're probably slotted further down. This is a shallow one. But all 3 of these pipes go into the hole that was drilled, and we end up with a well that looks like this with 3 different pipes, one that goes all the way down, one that goes less far down, one that's shallow. And then depending on what they've come up with, you got different cuttings. First 100 feet all brown, the steeper stuff all black. And since these are fully installed, this is what they look like. We've got our 3 completions there, and they're in a pipe. It's got a concrete pad surrounded by bollards. The 3 pipe used centralizers to help keep them separate. I mean, see how that worked. There's grout. The entire well installation report, I believe, is handout 3. So TPR folks, you have those at your disposal. This project team did not prepare that as a Kleinfelder document, so we can't address comments on those reports. But if you want to share concerns or thoughts about that, we can document them in our for the GSP and in how we address comments for what we're doing as well. There's some fatal flaw, we want to know about it. So if you find something you don't like, please speak up. The isotope study is underway. My understanding is that the groundwater sampling has already occurred. I don't know exactly where that's been, and the upstream sampling was just completed. Sandra, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes, all the isotope sampling for the groundwater and the stream gauges has been completed. We should get the report end of this month.
Great. And now we're
here again, real quick. Sandra, I noticed that at the location 129, SP 129, there was only 2 wells put in. One was put in fractured rock. The other well was put in the decomposed granite, but there was not one installed in the alluvial aquifer. Are you familiar with that? Is there a story behind that?
So, John, will you help me out? This is Frank's well, correct? Where there wasn't a residual layer.
And I'm going to go back to where it is, get it on a map.
Thank you.
It's up here. And, you know, Matt, my gut feeling is that there might not have been enough alluvium, or there wasn't any wetted alluvium at that location, considering how close it is to bedrock over here. But I wasn't on site and don't know for sure.
Yeah, so that's what, just to refresh my memory, sorry, it happened a while ago. So when we were out drilling, Kleinfelder was on site as the geologist, and they decided that there wasn't really a residuum layer, and there was only an alluvium and a bedrock. So we only put in 2 nested wells in that pipe, in that well.
Okay, that's helpful to understand. Thank you.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
The amount of residuum fluctuates across the basin, so not seeing some isn't really all that surprising. Advisory committee member comments? You guys probably lived it, so I don't think you have new questions for us.
No, and this is Sandra. We appreciate all their help and assistance that we got out in the field. They were great. Frank and Matt, we appreciate it.
All right.
Okay.
Public comment.
Moving on. Are there any public comments at this point? All right, hearing none.
Patsy, you did have 2 public comments in the chat
Yes.
early on in the conversation.
Yes.
I'm not sure how you want to handle that.
I believe they have both left. I believe that Sandra responded directly to Hank's question. And
Lonnie
I saw Lonnie left.
Right, so we have it documented. I think we can move on. We have it documented.
Thank you.
Okay. One question that I have, John, you mentioned that you would take written comments. By when do you want those written comments?
Oh, good thing you asked. Why, in fact, they're due Thursday, May 28th. Please send them to Sandra Carlson.
Okay, anything from anyone else? Any questions, comments, advice? You can see the date of the next, I'm sorry, what was that?
Yeah, minor error on this slide.
Yep.
The next TPR meeting is Thursday, July 9th in the morning, 10 to noon, like we typically do. And it'll be in person if we are allowed to meet in person, and if not, it'll be here on GoTo again.
Okay, so anything further from anyone for this morning?
We made it by 11:30.
That's kind of a miracle, actually. I didn't think that was going to happen. Thanks, everybody, for good questions, good discussion. Sandra, do you have anything else before we close out?
No, thank you, everybody. It was fabulous.
Yes, Jim Bennett. I just wanted to say,
everyone.
Yeah, I wanted to say that I thought the format was wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. I'm glad it worked for you and for everyone else. These are unusual times. Unusual times. Okay, then if no one has anything else, I think, Emily, we are finished, and thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
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 Bye.